YouTube is a remembered piece of history. Back then, in 2006, not much was known about it. Most of the community was just people uploading cat videos. But one particular user caused enough controversy to be recalled. The channel had posted a ton of gore porn and blood fetish material, earning them a ban for violating the site's terms of service. Such material can still be accessed, however. One day, a person on YouTube posted their experience with the channel from a defunct blogging website. I worked for YouTube during 2006. I was a busy employee and uploaded videos there too. What I didn't know was why some of the YouTube moderators had suspended a particularly troublesome account. I was more so wondering why I wasn't allowed to visit the page, rather than what was on it. Eventually, one of the other moderators handed me a piece of paper with a written link on it. He then pleaded me not to ask about the secret username ever again. The link led to a user page. The URL was simply www.youtube.com/666. That day, I went home after work and typed it into my computer, finding that the account was suspended. But when I refreshed the page several times, a few things happened. The layout became gradually more red and distorted. All of the video tags turned into the letters X666, and every single piece of text on the screen also said 666. I thought someone was hacking my computer, but I denied it and continued to refresh the page. Just then, a channel popped up. 666's banned channel. I looked at some of the videos. Most of them were crazy depictions of gore, smothered in distortion, swirled graphics. I decided to leave the video I was watching and went to click on another one, but a blank pop-up appeared instead. I clicked an empty button, and it took me to another video by 666. The video consisted of a woman drowning in a pool of blood and other horrible things happening. Naturally, I thought this was disgusting, so I tried to pause it. It didn't let me. It wasn't responding. I decided to close Internet Explorer, but it wouldn't budge. Going on another video didn't work either. I thought there was no way out, until I remembered. The power button, of course. I decided to shut down my computer so that whatever virus this was would relinquish its hold. But the button wouldn't work. Shutdown buttons respond all the time. I knew then that I must have been hacked. All hope was lost. I couldn't get out of Explorer, and the video just kept going on and on. The girl in it was staring at me, all while random, horrible sounds burst from my speakers. At the very end, her hand popped out of the video box and crashed my computer. After a few days, I was fired. That horrid experience with 666's channel had affected me too much, and I could no longer work my job. That was when I thought of something. Could this actually have been made by the devil? Or was it just a joke to scare YouTubers? Either way, the myth was very mysterious. I hadn't gotten any sleep after watching those videos. I wonder, Who made them? The blog spot became defunct after 2 days after the above blog was posted. If anyone tried to access it, a message would pop up saying, "Removed by admin, error code 666." The blogger sent me his experience by email, asking me to post this on the site. He also left a note. "Never visit nor refresh username 666. Once you have finished, it will never stop. It won't come out." I'm not sure what he means, but I hope no one has ever tried this. Hello. This happened to me a few months ago. I just need to share it with somebody. It all started at my friend's party. He's an artist who rented out a loft in the industrial part of town. If you can picture what a place like Detroit looked like in the 1920s, that's what this area looked like. Bunch of old turn-of-the-century factories crammed into 10 blocks. Most of them are abandoned. So, I partied a little too hard that night and decided to crash on a couch at the loft. I woke up around 4 a.m. Sun wasn't out yet, but you could still make things out in the dim blue light. I went to the bathroom, carefully tiptoeing around the people that were passed out on the floor. As I was taking a leak, I looked out the bathroom window and saw the panorama of deserted urban decay. I remembered how much I liked places like this. It was so dark and devoid of life, and strangely serene. I went back to the couch and tried to fall asleep. After 45 minutes of staring at the ceiling, I decided I didn't want to be there any longer. So, I swallowed my pride and decided to wake up my girlfriend to beg her for a ride, since walking around the vacant streets at this time was not an option. Being a good person, she was totally cool with it. She told me she would be there in about a half hour, that she would give me a call when she was outside. My phone died 10 minutes later, so I decided I would sit by the window and watch for her car. I sat there for a while. Eventually, my eyes started getting heavy, and I began to doze off. A crashing noise outside woke me up. It wasn't loud, but enough to snap me back into reality. I looked out the window and scanned the area, but didn't see anything. However, across the street from the loft, near a mountain of garbage bags and one of those enormous dumpsters, I did see a computer and monitor smashed against the floor that hadn't been there before. When my girlfriend arrived, I went downstairs and greeted her. Just as I was about to get in the car, I remembered a friend of mine who'd blown out his power supply, so I decided to walk over to the dumpster and see what I could salvage. The monitor was worthless, but the tower seemed to have suffered almost no damage, so I put it in the trunk and we drove off. About a week had passed, and I'd completely forgotten about the tower, till my girlfriend called me to let me know it was still in the trunk, and that she wanted it out. That night, I brought it home. Before I took it apart, I decided to hook it up to my monitor to see if it still worked. To my surprise, it did. It ran Windows XP and looked like it had been wiped clean. I decided to do searches for words like tits and pussy in hopes of finding some secret stash full of weird, deviant porn the previous owner had forgotten about. Morbid curiosity, I guess. But my search came up with nothing. There were no pictures. Then I searched for movies, and one came up. It was a.avi inside a folder titled Barbie, hidden in the Windows System 32 directory. So, I played it. And this is where things get disturbing. The movie was about an hour long. It was made up of what seemed like raw exported footage. The footage was of this woman sitting on a chair and talking against a white backdrop. I skipped through most of it, and it seemed like it was all the same continuous shot. I had decided to sit through the footage to find out what she was talking about. 15 seconds into it, the audio became extremely bad. Her voice was drowned in harsh static and background noise. I couldn't make out a thing. I imported the footage into Final Cut and tried to mess with the levels to isolate her voice. It helped a little, but I still couldn't hear what she was saying. I was intrigued now and began to really pay attention to her face and body language. It seemed that she was being asked questions because she stopped at times to listen, then continued talking. About 15 minutes into the footage, her face began to redden and contort, as if the questions were bothering her. But she continued to answer them anyway. Shortly after, she started to cry. She sobbed hysterically for the duration of the film. One of the few words I could lip read was, skin. She repeated this word many times throughout the footage, and at one point, she even pulled at the skin from her arm and mouthed the word. She seemed to be unhappy with it. It kept on building and building. When about 40 minutes in, she was crying so hard she could barely look at the camera. She stopped talking at this point. The rest of the footage was just her crying with her head down. Oddly enough, she didn't get up or move. The screen just faded to black. I was dumbfounded. I played the whole thing through many times that night, trying to find inflections and nuances in her movement that would reveal anything else about what was going on. I felt so dissatisfied. I wanted to know more. That was when I noticed that there were about 10 more minutes left on the timeline after the screen went black. 2 minutes past the darkness, there was more footage. The footage was extremely shaky, almost unwatchable, and depicted a pair of legs walking along train tracks. My guess is that the camera was accidentally left on as it was being carried somewhere. The person in this video walked along the tracks for about 6 minutes, then turned into the forest and walked over what looked like foliage, flattened by a piece of plywood. The person continued on this makeshift plywood road until the clip ended. I realized something, and my heart started beating with excitement. There were train tracks a few miles away that looked very similar to the ones in the video. I had to check this out. I came up with my friend Ezra. He's 6'4", 250 pounds of mostly muscle. I convinced him to go on a little adventure with me. I'm no pushover myself, but I felt if I was to go wandering in the woods looking for God knows what, some extra muscle couldn't hurt. The whole idea of investigating this video had me so excited I couldn't sleep. The next morning, on a sunny Saturday, I took my flashlight, camera, and a 7-inch K-bar knife with a matte black finish and serrated edge. I went to pick up Ezra. When I got to his house, he wasn't even awake. When I woke him up, he pretty much told me to piss off. I was already packed and I had mentally prepared myself to do this, so I decided to go through with it without him. I parked my car at the train station, took my stuff, and hopped onto the tracks. After walking for about 2 hours, I saw a broken piece of plywood. My knees almost buckled with excitement. I searched the nearby foliage, and there it was, a little plywood trail leading off into the forest. I walked slowly along the trail, paying close attention to everything. I would stop occasionally, kneel down, and listen for anything or anyone. But it was so quiet. This was one of the most nerve-wracking things I'd ever done. I didn't know what to expect at the end of this trail. The dense tree line gave way to a little island of grassy field. And then I saw it. A house being consumed by the forest. From the look of it, no one had lived there for 20, maybe 30 years. I got my camera and snapped a few pics. A few yards away from the house was a tool shed made of rusty sheet metal. I just sat there among the trees for a while, absorbing everything. I didn't want to go into the open field. I had a feeling that something would see me. It took me a while to muster up the courage to go up to the house. The door was partly open. I pushed it in with the flashlight and was relieved that the inside was actually very well lit. I put the flashlight away, got my camera, took a few more pics. There was no furniture. The floor was riddled with bricks, wood, and other rubble. Some of the walls had huge holes in them. When I went in further to explore, I saw some things that I didn't pay much mind to in the moment. Now that I think about them in hindsight, they greatly disturb me. First thing that seemed a little odd was that one of the doors in the first room that I presume led to the basement seemed a little too new to be in this house. It was also the only door that was locked. Also, when I made my way up to the second floor, I saw some chairs and a fold-up table that also seemed much too new to be there. But what disturbed me the most was the bathroom. The dust on the mirror had been wiped away, and in the bathtub, I saw a clear plastic tarp still had water droplets on it, from when I presumed it was last washed clean. That was when I heard something moan really loud. I jumped out of the second-story window and ran back to the tracks. Halfway there, I realized that the moaning was most likely a water pipe expanding or contracting. That little moment of relief gave way to horror when I wondered why the water would be running in an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. It It's been a little more than 2 months since this happened. I haven't gone back there. Nor do I plan to. After uploading a number of horror stories to various places around the internet, I was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of supportive emails and messages I received. It spurred me on to write more, to take my ambitions seriously, and to commit an increasing amount of my time to the pursuit of becoming a published author. Little did I know that this newfound acknowledgement of my writing would lead to a series of horrific and abhorrent events. For over a year, I received numerous messages and emails, most very positive and enjoyable. Yet every few days, I would also find a strange, disconnected, and fragmented piece of correspondence sitting in my inbox. Each email would consist of one random word as a subject heading, with the message itself comprised of a simple phrase, normally only 2 words long. The email address would change each time, but it was clear from the nature of the content that the author was the same. At first, I dismissed them as the idle product of a bored lurker on the internet, attempting to amuse themselves with the thought of myself reading garbled, puzzling, yet worryingly cryptic messages. As the days wore on, however, and the emails became gradually more twisted and prophetic, I began to suspect that they were of a far more sinister origin. I had posted and contributed to many websites and forums over the years. It was not unusual to wake up each morning to 20 or 30 new emails to my inbox. I often spent my lunch break answering them, and I genuinely enjoyed the correspondence. However, the day after posting a story called "The Passenger," I followed my usual routine of logging into my email account at noon, only to find one message which stood out most uncomfortably from the others. The subject heading was "Suffer," and the email itself contained just 2 words: "Baby cries." I sent the message to my trash folder and thought nothing more of it. Until later that night. It had been a long day. As I had been writing from dusk to dawn, I was tiring rapidly, feeling suitably ready for a good, long overdue sleep. It was around 11:30 p.m., and just as I had started to drift into a dream, I heard a noise. It was not out of place, nor did it cause any real concern to me, coming as it did from my neighbor's house through the wall. It was the type of common sound any resident is familiar with. I smirked to myself, thinking, "Baby cries," and drifted back to sleep, sure that the child's mother or father would soon be there to comfort it, as they always were. I awoke again, glancing at my mobile phone, which cast an unearthly green glow around the room. Seeing that it was after 3 in the morning, I became agitated, knowing that I had a long day ahead of me. Rest does not come easily on those nights when we know we must rise early. The mere thought of necessity of a good night's sleep before the next day's work precludes any notion of sleep itself. Lying there, I listened in the darkness to the infant next door, breaking its heart, inconsolable and distraught. Surely the parents had not let it scream for all those hours. Lying there alone in the blackness of night, unattended. After trying to block out the child's cries for what seemed like hours, I admitted defeat, moved to the spare room that my family and friends normally stayed in, on the rare occasion that they visited. At 7:30 a.m., my phone alarm sounded, and after fighting the reality of another day, I reluctantly left my bed, walking slowly to the kitchen to make some coffee. From the window, I looked out onto the street below, and what I saw horrified me. A police car and 2 ambulances parked outside of my neighbor's home. Even through my groggy, pre-caffeinated mind, the memory of that helpless child crying in the night sprung to the fore. Immediately, I stopped what I was doing, threw on some clothes, and ran outside. I was not the only person watching. As usual, nosy residents stood at their doors, with some even out on the street, still wearing their dressing gowns, idly gossiping, whipping up any number of scandalous rumors, asking several onlookers what had happened. I was told a variety of accounts, from a child being abducted to someone having a seizure during the night. A hush fell over the street as my neighbor's front door finally opened, slowly. 3 officers exited the house somberly as a collective gasp seeped out from the mouths of the crowd of onlookers. Quickly behind, 2 men in sterile white clothing carried a stretcher, and on it, a body bag containing the now deceased remains of one of my former neighbors. A few cries rang out from the street. Those who knew them wept, while those who did not gossiped. Then, another silence, followed by another stretcher and another body bag. This time, no one uttered a sound. The street was void of noise. A tangible tension spread through the air. A hanging sense of dread as all of us waited, hoping beyond hope for no more death. Heartbreak. Last stretcher, supporting a small and insignificant shroud, was carried out solemnly into the morning air and placed carefully into the back of an ambulance. Tears were wept, and answers were demanded from the police. But I could not cope with the sight. I could not bear it. The sound of that poor infant screaming through the night, screaming for its very life, rang out in my ears. The sound of a child, now forever silenced. The memory was deafening. How was I supposed to know? A child had cried before, as many do. I didn't know. I walked, dazed, back through my garden and into the now hollow sanctuary of my house. I'm not ashamed to say that I cried. Cried knowing that maybe if I had just paid attention or shown more concern than simply getting to sleep, that if I had noticed something was amiss, I could have called the police, and perhaps they would still be alive. Several hours later, 2 police officers arrived at my door to ask if I had seen or heard anything unusual from the night before. They said that they were not at liberty to tell me what had happened, but that any information I could give them would help immensely with their investigation. When I told them about the email I had received, They looked at each other with an obvious sense of skepticism. When I showed it to them, they asked if they could have my login details in an attempt to trace where the email came from. Of course, I gave it to them, and then they left after saying that they would be in touch. As soon as they were gone, I returned to the computer screen to switch it off. I recoiled in horror at the sight of another cryptic email sitting in my inbox. Subject heading said, "Fan," and the email again contained only 2 short words. 2 words which drove fear through every part of my being. It simply read, "You told." I was utterly unprepared for the events which followed. This was posted on a now defunct message board known as the Bum's Library, a forum with the stated purpose of sharing anecdotes and personal stories. This post was made in mid-2009. Hey guys, I've been pretty active in the library for a couple years. I finally mustered up the courage to share the weirdest thing that happened to me. This occurred in Sarton, Arizona, my hometown. Don't bother looking it up, because as of 2000, it doesn't exist. Sarton was a close-knit town. We had approximately 4,000 people, and everyone knew each other and helped each other out. It was a typical town in small America. I was a pretty studious kid, graduated top of my class. Well, technically graduated. I'll explain later. I wanted to pursue politics as an adult. Yeah, I was an idiot. So I was active in my town's local government and attended every city council meeting. One day, September 1st, 1999, we had another council meeting. Just a normal meeting. I think we were discussing a new shopping plaza opening in a nearby town or something like that. I was 17 at the time and was working as an assistant to the mayor. So a group of about 70 or so people arrive in the town hall and take their seats. The first 15 minutes were normal, small-town stuff. In the middle of a discussion, a man rose from his seat. We'll just call him Alan. He was a young man, maybe 5 years older than me. I never knew him personally, but everyone said he was a jolly guy. One of the stoner types. Alan didn't say a word. Just pulled a revolver out of his jacket and shot himself in the head. I remember it vividly. The way he instantly fell to the floor. The blood leaking from his eyes and ears. The old lady next to him screaming. Brain matter painted across the side of her face. Naturally, the meeting was called off, and the town went into a period of mourning. Schools were closed for a week. Many parents took their kids out of town. I was pretty shocked. That week was a blur. I think all I did was just watch TV and played on my console. Come Monday of next week, when school was going to reopen, nobody seemed to care. It's not like they'd moved on. They acted as if it never had happened. I got the courage to ask some folks around town. I was a shy kid. They said Alan was still alive. Even better, they said there was never a council meeting that day, as the mayor was sick with the flu. I went to the mayor himself, and he confirmed that he had had a bad case of the flu. I asked for the city records. He was a bit surprised but trusted me and let me look. Sure enough, there was no meeting on September 1st. Later, I visited Alan himself. He invited me in, and we played video games for a while. He was a cool guy, just enjoying his life, almost like a modern hippie. Regardless, I asked him about his suicide. He thought I was playing a prank and laughed it off. He said he would never think of committing suicide, much less in a public place. He told me he was anti-gun and didn't even own a firearm. Thoroughly creeped out, I left the house. I became obsessed with the incident, to the point my parents thought I was mentally ill. Even the weird conspiracy theory kids at school thought I was off my rocker. Christmas time rolled around, and I decided to take a road trip. With my parents' blessing, I drove to Albuquerque to stay with my cousin. After getting hammered at a New Year's party, despite being too young for that, I drunkenly told my cousin about the incident. To my shock, he believed me. He was always an out there kind of guy, always telling me about UFOs he saw and stuff like that. We discussed our thoughts for a while. He, of course, thought it was aliens. I toyed with the idea of a crazy hallucination, and maybe I was indeed crazy. Nonetheless, I left back for Sarton shortly after New Year's. I thought I got lost for a while. If you weren't alive in the 90s, GPS was very primitive and pretty crappy. It said there was no Sarton on the map. Whatever, I thought GPS was unreliable. I stopped at a gas station in a nearby town and picked up a map of the area. Imagine my surprise when the Sarton was gone. I asked the cashier, and he told me there was no Sarton, and where it would be was just a gravel road and a secluded path of desert. I went to that area. Sure enough, it's just a shitty gravel road, the only other living thing being cacti. I'm ashamed to admit this, but I got out of the car and threw up on the road. My hometown, my parents, were all gone. I immediately returned to Albuquerque with my cousin. He lost his shit, but he allowed me to live with him. He was a law student, so he was out of the house a lot. One day, I used the house phone to call up my grandparents. They lived in Albuquerque. I asked for a copy of my birth certificate, saying I was just curious. When it arrived, I nearly shat myself. Same birth date, same parents, same everything. Except for the fact that it said I was born in Albuquerque. I asked my grandparents about my parents. They told me that my mom died in childbirth. My dad died of cancer when I was 4. For all intents and purposes, I was raised by my grandparents. I don't even remember the next year. I stopped talking about the incident, even to my cousin. In the outside world, I just played along with the new story of my life. I graduated top of my class in 2000 without saying a single word about this to anyone. Me and my cousin had a pact to ignore the incident and just play along. Pretty soon, I think he started to believe the story. I'm 26 now. I just graduated with a doctorate from UNM. I have a loving girlfriend. Managed to break out of my shell and make some real friends. I never spoke a word about the incident, but it's been bothering me since it happened. The 10-year anniversary is coming up, so I decided to reopen this. If no one in my real life will believe me, then maybe the internet will. If you lived in the Tucson area in the late 90s, do you remember Sarton, Arizona? What did you do in the Great Cyberwar? Well, the answer is pretty much what everyone else did, which is try and survive. In other words, nothing. The first we all knew about it was when the electricity went off and did not come back on again. Then other utilities, water, gas, and phones. Then the net itself went down, and everyone was in the dark, both literally and figuratively. All of that within the space of a few hours. For some, it happened overnight, and they awoke to a broken world. Most cars still ran, for a while, although GPS was also out. Self-driving cars didn't. When the fuel ran out, the gas stations were not pumping, no electricity. The supermarkets, along with everyone else, could not buy or sell because the payment systems were offline. Within 24 hours, looting broke out on a global scale, from the richest nations to the poorest, and martial law became the new norm. Nobody died directly in the first cyber strikes. However, as days turned into weeks and looting became rioting, and in many places turned into civil war, the casualties headed into the millions as governments struggled to organize the necessities of life. In much of the world, disease and mass starvation added to the deaths. I had some notion of just how bad it was a couple of nights after the strike. In the cities, people, for the first time, had a clear view of the night sky, once fires had died down. It was total blackness. We went outside, onto the roof, and watched the shooting stars. Except they were anything but. They were debris from satellites re-entering and burning up. It's been 2 years now, and I can't exactly say things have returned to normal. Food is still rationed, since distribution was the hardest part of the infrastructure to recover. And such fictions as money and credit no longer mean anything. It's all turned very old-school Soviet, with a command economy where the military is the backbone, complete with uncooperative people being put into labor camps, and everyone being assigned work, whether they like it or not. No work, no eat. It turns out that things like human rights take a back seat when your stomach is empty. A lot of criminals are still being summarily executed by firing squad after brief tribunal hearings. Meanwhile, the political arguments rage around what to do with the now totally insolvent and bankrupt financial system, with a majority calling for a year zero plan of debt and asset cancellation. The minority who are rich are vehemently disagreeing. Elsewhere, that question is being settled by gunfire in the streets, bankers hanging from lampposts, and revolutions. At least we have avoided that. For now. As someone said, it was like World War III, but without the nukes, and everyone surviving. At first. for those nations that had civil defense planning, which most did not. It was either too little by being geared to localized natural disasters such as earthquakes, or too little by being geared towards an expectation that most people would be dead, and hence not a problem. So, what happened? Nobody knows, and if they do, it has not been made official public knowledge. However, enough information has leaked that we have a good idea of the sequence of events, if not exactly who did what, or where to assign the blame. It started as some kind of tit-for-tat three-way petty annoyance between the US, Russia, and China, with targeted attacks across the net on infrastructure, such as electricity generation, during some trade disputes, amid accusations of hacking. The problem that became apparent was that it was almost impossible to locate the origin of the attacks, so certain assumptions were made. The most crucial one being that only major state actors were involved. It was later determined that this was not true, although who or what was acting as agent provocateur is not clear. At least that's the story. Conspiracy nuts are split on this, either it being covered up by them, meaning our secret government, aka New World Order, aka Illuminati, etc., or it was a global conspiracy of organized crime of the James Bond variety. Most people just think it's an excuse to dodge blame, or at least not point the finger at someone with nukes still ready to go. Others suggest factions within rogue nations, or even casual hackers and griefers who just got a bit too lucky. If the latter is true, they are keeping a very low profile, i.e. shitting themselves. Or, more likely, once the audit trails were reconstructed, they found themselves quietly dead. A number of other factors massively exacerbated the situation. The most serious was that all the major security agencies hoarded computer vulnerabilities for their own use instead of collaborating with industry to fix them. The second factor was unavoidable. It was the use of artificial intelligence as a war-fighting tool, because it was expected that humans could not respond fast enough beyond a certain threshold or a trigger point where the war became automated. The AIs from that point had permission not only to defend by whatever means necessary, or even launch their own attacks, but were allowed to choose their targets based on what they were learning as the war unfolded. The third factor was a political decision taken long before all this happened by at least one participant. It came to be known as the last man standing doctrine. This basically said that the winners would be those nations which did not take part in the war. Since the AIs were directed to win the war, this meant they instantly escalated to non-combatants in order to make sure there was no last man standing anywhere on Earth. Reputedly, and to much official denial from all parties, even allies were targeted. Within minutes, attacks were launched all across Asia, Europe, and Latin America before any human knew what was happening, and each side assumed one of the others was knowingly responsible. The predictable response was a lot of petty players joining in the fight, and later muddied the waters further as they used it as an opportunity to settle old scores the traditional way, with military forces and series of real wars across most of the politically unstable regions of the world. In addition, in previous such incidents, neither side used either their best weapons, Stuxnet accepted, or all of them simultaneously, nor did they attack with the aim of doing maximum permanent damage. At this point, much of the net was still functioning because all sides needed it for offensive operations. But at about an hour into the war, an inflection point occurred where the AI's decided defense would be primary, and net connections were severed. Some of them physically by explosives that had been placed on undersea cables. China fared somewhat better with its Great Firewall, but in truth, it was leaky and offensive operations into China continued. Elsewhere, it made almost no difference other than taking civilian computers offline. Even as nations were trying to isolate themselves, a second wave of attacks emerged from the Internet of Things. Devices that had been suborned into botnets weeks, months, or in some cases years in the past. Later, jokingly referred to as the attack of the toasters, made the isolation tactics pointless. On all sides, by 2 hours into the war, military forces were on standby, and politicians were being briefed on developments. Then, some of the tens of thousands of low-orbit comsats that provided cheap global net connections by competing nations and corporations began to go dark. That is, although they apparently continued to route traffic according to intelligent analysts, control had been lost, and nobody knew exactly what they were doing or who was operating them. At this point, at least 2 fateful decisions were made. The first was to order all non-military comsats shut down for the duration, and the second was to hit those that failed to do so with anti-satellite missiles. This decision occurred almost simultaneously in at least 2 nations. There's one good thing that prevented the war from turning traditional hot. Nations only attack their own assets. That provided a breathing space long enough for the human political establishments to talk over what remained of secure comlinks, mostly through landlines or geosyncs, which was just as well, because a few hours after the missiles were launched to take out the hacked sats, more of them started to disintegrate. Radar showed a Kessler cascade. The debris from destroyed satellites was hitting others and breaking them apart, and so on. Low Earth orbit was being cleared of functioning systems by an ever-expanding cloud of debris. The most expensive fireworks show in history. Hostilities officially ceased within 24 hours. The damage was immense, with the net being severely fragmented and most of its bandwidth disappearing for years. Nobody was going to be putting up new satellites into the shotgun blasts sweeping around the planet. The major problem was getting the electricity grids working and stable. In some places, this took weeks. It's a non-trivial thing to restart a hacked continental grid from scratch, and highly non-trivial to restart a global economy. Damaged far beyond that of even the worst recession or depression. Plus, when electricity was available and parts of the net came online, attacks from dormant or fragmented botnets would flare up, most as distributed denial of service shots, flailing around at nonsensical targets that ate up the bandwidth and time as they were tracked down and eliminated. Meanwhile, just about every business on the planet was technically bankrupt. Total cost to date, estimated 50 million dead, $40 trillion in damage.